Hello, my name is Peter Sargent. I'm the chair of the Small Practice Group, and today I'm also the chair of our webinar entitled "PrePacks Are Here to Stay, Love Them or Hate Them." Whether indeed you love them or hate them, PrePacks are now part of the business rescue landscape and are, in the opinion of many, here to stay. The insolvency regimes of some nations seems to suffer from prepackophobia, whilst others embrace them wholeheartedly. You'll be pleased to know that you aren't going to have to listen to me for the whole of this webinar. I have some very interesting people for you to hear from. From the UK, we have Stuart Hopewell, who is the chair of the UK's PrePack pool. The rules around PrePacks in the UK have gone through some very recent changes, and Stuart will tell us all about them and also explain what the pool is and all about. From India, we have Ravinder Gupta, aka Rocky, Project Director Early Warning India in Delhi. India has recently introduced a PrePack procedure for SMEs. It is very different to how the UK does things, and I won't spoil Rocky's thunder by saying any more. Finally, let me introduce John Baird, aka Jock, of Windire Chambers, Sydney, Australia. From my reading of Australian insolvency commentary, the Australian businesses hate PrePacks and consider them to be the devil's work. Again, not to spoil Jock's thunder, I will say no more. But what in reality is a PrePack? Well, to keep it simple, to me, it's a pre-arranged sale of a business, all neatly packaged up and sold onto a new entity. So what's the problem, you might say? Well, the mischief, some would say, is the fact that the business is insolvent. And the ones who are generally concerning themselves with we're here today are sold back to the previous management, who could be described as those who have actually drove the bus off the cliff. For the sake of total transparency, I must declare that Stuart and I worked together on the IPA's Membership and Authorisation Committee. We sat alongside each other like the two old grumpy men from the Muppets. And I'm going to invite Stuart to start our conversation this afternoon. Thanks very much, Stuart, and over to you.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Hello, Muppet. Yes, my declaration of interest, as Peter says, is that I'm a director. I'm not chairman yet, but I'm director of PrePack Pool Limited, which, as I'll explain later, is now an evaluator under the new system. I suppose in a little bit of history, I hope Peter will correct me if I get the date wrong, but the Enterprise Act around about 2003 set the ball rolling on PrePacks, because we didn't have administration as such before. We had receivership, but administration came in. And the inventive insolvency practitioners of the time gradually introduced what we call the PrePack now, which, as Peter says, is a prepackaged sale of the business almost immediately upon administration. At the time, I was a credit manager, another declaration of self-interest, and credit managers and unsecured creditors generally hated them. Not quite as passionately probably as our Australian friends at the moment, but it was the lack of transparency surrounding them, the fact that it was a fait accompli, and you basically didn't get any money back as an unsecured creditor. And the connected party type PrePack, where it was sold back to the original owners, left creditors high and dry. I remember at the time being in the north, following Leeds United, not as a supporter, but just as a business. Leeds United went through two of these PrePacks. Caused a lot of consternation. I think that was the first start of public antipathy towards PrePacks. But they carried on for quite some time until 10 years later, 2013, the then Business Secretary in Parliament, Sir Vince Cable, invited Theresa Graham to research PrePacks and find out what was wrong with them and why people didn't like them. And essentially it just came down to two words: transparency and trust. And the government at the time was very keen on transparency and trust, strangely for a government, and implemented the new PrePack regulations. And those regulations included changes to what we have here called SIP 16, Standard Insolvency Practice, which meant that you had to prove that you'd been advertising the business correctly. You had to prove that it was sold at a good value. And there were 6 recommendations in total, but one of which was the PrePack pool, as say I'm a director of, And the pre-pack pool was meant to give an independent opinion as to whether the pre-pack was a good deal. In other words, to try and head off some of the criticisms that they were getting. The problem was that this was voluntary. Not everybody wanted to do it. And I think the insolvency professionals felt a bit slighted that these independent muppets were going to come along and check whether they'd done a good job. That wasn't the point at all. The point was that the independents were looking at the deal, looking at the application, looking at the buyer and saying, has this been done above board? They were only interested in the sale back to the current owners, the connected parties. But the voluntary system essentially failed. Less than 10% of deals were coming across our desk as independent reviewers. And so the government recently as April the 30th, came out with a mandatory scheme. Everything is more or less the same, other than the owner of the failed business now has to send their proposal in to an independent, what is now called evaluator. This is a new role, one that we've taken on, and the evaluator has only got two options. Yes, the deal's good. No, the deal isn't good. We used to have an in-between before that said, it looks okay, but we could have done it with a bit more information. But that in a nutshell is where we are at the moment. These independent evaluations are carried out on behalf of the acquirer. There has been some movement in that we are now allowed to, and in fact encouraged to, ask questions of the insolvency practitioner, and they're encouraged to help us out with the investigation. And we have to pull together a report and send that in to the administrator, and that becomes a public document. Remains to be seen whether it will make any difference. I can say that since the 30th of April, we at the PrePack pool have had 3 applications sent to us so far. The other thing to point out is there are other evaluators out there. We're not the only game in town, and it will be, I think, a competitive market going forward. I did a seminar talk for R3, one of our insolvency groups, a couple of weeks ago, and was given a lecture for advertising the PrePack pool. That's not what I'm here to do today, Peter. I'm here to just talk about the role of an evaluator. Thanks.
Stuart, that's great. Thanks very much for setting the scene from the UK. Jock, as I read about Australian insolvency, is that pre-packs are the devil's work. And, you know, I haven't seen anybody say anything good about pre-packs. So tell us what's the Australian point of view.
Our position, Peter, was not dissimilar to that which Stuart has described leading up to the recent regulations in the UK. I wouldn't use the word the devil's own work, but there's no doubt about it that there was abuse of the system, undeniably, and that created a strong negative pushback from the professional organisation in Australia called ARETA, Australian Restructuring, Insolvency and Turnaround Association, which eventually has wound up in legislation, which has basically made pre-packs a lot harder to do in Australia than they were previously. What happened was that in February 2020, Australia amended its Corporations Act by this wonderfully named act, the Treasury Laws Amendment Combating Illegal Phoenixing Act of 2020. The name really says it all. However, what it did was to insert 3 new sections into the Corporations Act, somewhat inspirationally named 588 FDB, 588 GAA, and 588 GAB, all of which had the stated object of deterring the practice called phoenixing, i.e. disposing of a company's assets in order to avoid its obligations to creditors. Now, the difference between a phoenix and a genuine pre-pack is somewhat blurred in my view. I see for myself nothing wrong with a pre-arranged sale, provided, of course, that it's proper value. It doesn't necessarily have to be at arm's length, but they're preferable. But certainly it has to be able to stack up to independent scrutiny. And the trouble was, of course, that there were far too many so-called pre-packs going through that simply were basically selling off the business back to the very directors, as you said, Peter, who'd got the company into trouble in the first place. And the legislation, to some extent, in my view, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The they came up with a definition called a creditor defeating disposition, namely if the consideration payable to the company for the disposition was less than the market value of the property or the best price reasonably obtainable for the property at that time, and the disposition had the effect of preventing the property from becoming available for the benefit of the company's creditors. That's like the Insolvent Transactions and our Conveyancing Act, I think goes all the way back to the Elizabethan Statute of Frauds, that language. The process of delaying the assets from becoming available or hindering or significantly delaying the process. It imposed a duty on any officer of the company who engaged in that conduct that resulted in the company making a creditor defeating disposition, and thereby imposed personal liability on that officer if the company was insolvent or became insolvent because of the disposition, or was placed in external administration as a result of the disposition. And the objective test was there if the officer knew, or a reasonable person in his position would have known, that the disposition was a creditor defeating disposition. But they didn't stop there, Peter. They went further and imposed exactly the same personal liability on any person who engaged in conduct of procuring, inciting, inducing, or encouraging the making of a creditor defeating disposition. And that would clearly catch a voluntary administrator unless he was undertaking a bona fide restructure of the company. However, it excluded provisional liquidator, or administrator of a deed of company arrangement. So that's what they've done in Australia. And I think you'd say it's pretty hard to get an illegitimate PrePack up now. And I haven't seen a legitimate one go through yet.
Jock, thanks for that. That's really interesting. Do you get what I would describe quite facetiously as frequent flyers? In other words, people who go round and round the system time and time again, or try to go round and round the system time and time again?
We call them serial offenders over here, and the answer is yes. There have been two sides. Firstly, there have been companies that have gone in and out of administration with a PrePack more than once, sometimes 2 or 3 times. But what the evil was really addressed to was an industry was growing up of certain promoters who were not registered liquidators, associated with others who were prepared to go along with the process. And they were really phoenixing. There's no doubt about it. There was a genuine industry in phoenixing, and it had to be stopped. But in so doing, I think they've just made it too hard to do a legitimate PrePack. Anyway, that's my view. I could be in the minority.
So they've basically scared the duck off the water, so nobody wants to do it anymore. Yeah.
Unless you absolutely set it up in a legitimate sense. And in a funny way, you could go back to what the 1980s position was. That's prior to the Cork report and prior to our Harmer report, whereby if you were in that situation, you would put a provisional liquidator in the company, and he would then sell off the business at arm's length with external valuations. So in one sense, we've almost gone full circle.
Oh yeah, the court gives the protection. And so on that point, Rocky, my understanding of the procedures which have been introduced in India for SMEs, it's much more a court-driven procedure, and it's all very new, isn't it?
The PrePack just came in on 4th of April this year. We have had the insolvency code since 2016. Our code is basically for the corporate entities, not for non-corporate entities as of now. A requirement was there for some companies which were under MSMEs to be given some sort of protection, because not many resolution plans used to come for small companies. So they brought in PrePack last month. Now these PrePacks are only for MSME registered entities. And if I can give you some sort of statistics, there are around 63 million MSMEs in India. Out of that, only I believe is around 1 million of them are corporate entities. And so, in fact, if you see, these PrePacks are available for 1 million entities. But if you see from the other perspective, 62 million are left out of it. Right.
Yeah.
So this is one gap which needs to be fulfilled. There is also one other challenge there. You said that it is in UK, it is basically a sale of business. Here we have a mix of both these things, where in the first instance, the owner of the business has to give a plan of his own. If the creditors do not accept that plan, then a third party can come in and give their own plan of resolution, so that they can take over that business. But I don't know how much it would be successful in India.
That's interesting. That so somebody from the outside could come in and cut across what was planned to happen, and take the business away from whoever was putting the original plan together.
That seems not probable at this point in time, because if you see, since 2016, when we had a insolvency and bankruptcy code, which was legislated, only 13% of businesses have been turned around or given back to new entities. The rest of them have gone into liquidation. So, and for MSMEs, most of them are in an unorganized sector, and it's difficult to understand where the money is. There are no proper books of accounts. Sometimes even the promoters are illiterate. So somebody taking over their business without any sort of financial reports, I don't think it's probable.
I think the other interesting point you make straight away was the fact that it only covers sort of corporate entities, yet most of small Indian businesses sound as if there are sole traders, maybe partnerships, which contrasts completely with, say, the UK and I guess in Australia, Jock, where most businesses, SMEs, will be small limited liability companies. So what can an unincorporated business do, Rocky? Is there anything there for them?
See, we are awaiting the notification of that part of that act, which is already there, but it has not been notified. So we are just waiting for that.
Right. So at present, if you were an unincorporated SME, you'd be in limbo. There's very little you could do.
So there are two older acts from the British era, which are there, but they take around 15 to 20 years for them to make a company insolvent.
Jock's comment about Sir Kenneth Cork and the Cork Report actually reminds me that I predate the Cork Report, and I remember going to what was Huddersfield Polytechnic, now Huddersfield University, to listen to Sir Kenneth Cork talk about the Insolvency Act, which he was planning to introduce, which was completely revolutionary back in those days. So, you know, it was an amazing thing. So, Jock, you've just stirred lots of memories, you know, in that way. But what I really wanted to start with, talk about, was to try and expand things. Like, Stuart, now in the UK, you've got to have a report. You've got to have a report.
If it's connected, yes.
If it's a connected party. Who pays for it and how much does it cost?
Okay, the applicant pays for it, the company doing the deal, and it's £1,500 plus VAT. And the promise is that the report is done by our firm within 48 hours. We don't know what the competition are offering at the moment.
I've been inundated with people saying, I'd like to be your evaluator. And, you know, you start getting prices for it, you know.
I haven't seen any competitive prices yet.
No, I'll let you know if I see anything.
We do know of at least two other companies putting a process together, one of which is merely a recruitment hub. And he's an ex Grant Thornton guy, and he will recruit evaluators to his website. It's almost like brokering the deal, and you can choose your evaluator. That does seem to go against the spirit of the legislation that says we want an independent evaluation, please.
Yeah, and you know, just one further point, my understanding is if I don't like what the evaluator says, I can go and get another report.
You could go and get another report, or the IP could just go ahead with the deal anyway, which again is a major flaw,
so
really.
It could effectively drive through a red traffic light and
yes, but then he'd have to justify the reason for doing it to his professional body.
Jock, in Australia, if you wanted to do what we loosely call a PrePack, how would you be able to justify it? Would you have to get some sort of a second opinion on what you were doing?
You don't need a second opinion, Peter, but you do have to, under the Act, have independent valuations, either of the assets, particularly, of course, the tangible assets, and preferably a valuation as a going concern. What happens a lot in PrePacks is they don't actually sell the business on as a going concern, including goodwill and everything else, particularly if it's not an arm's length transaction. They'll buy the plant and equipment, as many of the debtors as they need, and a couple of other, maybe they might take over a few leases, and of course they'll cherry pick their employees. And to be brutal, they'll leave the rest hanging. So the valuations have to be of the tangible assets, and they have to stack up. And if they don't stack up, then there's personal liability on everyone, Peter.
You're right. Oh, wow. So, you know, so the insolvency practitioner can get drawn into it as well for doing a bad deal.
Oh, very much so. In fact, it makes, you've only got two choices if I were an IP now. One is to let the directors do the deal, sign the contracts, then appoint an administrator and allow the administrator to decide whether or not effectively to disclaim the deal or to complete it. That way, there's an argument that he didn't enter into the agreement and therefore he shouldn't be personally liable.
Yeah.
That's not wonderfully attractive. If I were advising an administrator on that, I'd tell him to be very, very careful indeed. But maybe that way the personal liability would remain with the directors and not fall on the administrator, Peter. The other way of doing it is to do it by the book, and I haven't seen one yet in a year and 2 months, which is stack up all the valuations and make sure everything is absolutely rigid-edge. By the time you do that, you're not really selling it back to the recalcitrant directors. You're probably selling it to a friendly third party. Yeah. And if there's proper consideration paid and the price is fair, and then the administrator becomes the liquidator and distributes amongst creditors in the ordinary course, there can be little argument. I just haven't seen one of those old-fashioned ones go through yet.
Yeah. So Rocky, in the Indian situation, you know, have there actually been any PrePacks done which involve the court?
Since they have been legislated by way of ordinance, we are under a lockdown. 4th of April, right? And but I would like to say that the difference between the insolvency and a PrePack is that in an insolvency we have creditor in possession, where in PrePack we have a debtor in possession. And like you have an evaluator, we only have insolvency professional handling everything, from monitoring of the board of directors, from evaluations. Everything is being done by the IP.
So everything depends on the quality of the insolvency practitioner, on the integrity of the insolvency practitioner. Yes. And, you know, there's no independent oversight, unlike in the UK where you now have the evaluator.
Yes, but there are some checks and balances in terms of you can complain against the IP with the regulator. In case the committee of creditors find that there is some sort of a fraud or preferential treatment has been given to certain entities, then immediately they can ask for a creditor in possession, wherein the IP, the insolvency professional, takes over the company from the debtor.
So there is some protection. Stuart, you're going to say something.
Well, I was going to say, don't forget it's only 2 weeks old, this legislation of having independent evaluation. I wouldn't want listeners and viewers to think that before that it was totally unregulated, as Peter would know. The insolvency professionals are highly regulated. In fact, complain they're too highly regulated, A, by their professional bodies, and overseen by the Insolvency Service as a regulator of last resort. And yes, it's all handled by the IP, and 90% of connected parties were all handled without any independent valuation up until recently. So there are controls, Rocky. I wouldn't want you to think that there aren't any controls. It's not the Wild West over there.
John, when we often see businesses which are sold on through a PrePack, and everybody applauds the saving of the jobs and the saving of the businesses, but what's the view of actually the returns to creditors? You know, is it PrePack going to give a better return to creators generally, or does it make no difference, or maybe it's even worse? Do we have a view?
Peter, and I'm going back to my experience as a solicitor going back 15 years now. At that time, early noughties, so to speak, PrePacks were in favour where they were for legitimate purposes. The ones that I came across where the business was in severe jeopardy, often the directors had left it very late, and they probably only had like 7 days cash left to trade. And so if something wasn't done very, very quickly, the whole business would fail and all of the employees would be out of a job, and there'd be very little for creditors of any kind whatsoever. In fact, the business was probably in such dire straits that the bank would appoint a receiver and that would be the end of it. So PrePacks in the early noughties were not uncommon for legitimate purposes in order to save the central parts of the business. You might have to drop off a few side bits, but keep your key employees, keep your key suppliers, and try and return to profitability. But the new amendments, as we're saying in 2020, 2021, make that very hard to do, because the amount of time you've got to spend getting valuations basically defeats the purpose of putting a quick sale through.
Yeah.
You're probably better to go into a serious administration. In Australia, we have a thing called a deed of company arrangement. I think it's pretty similar to your scheme of arrangement, or you've got a deed arrangement over there, don't you, as well?
You have CVA or something like that, yeah.
CVA, thank you. So the better way to do it, if you had time and you had more than a week up your sleeve, like you had a month, you would appoint an administrator, and the administrator would put together a deed of company arrangement, which would then be voted on by creditors. And if approved, that's how you can get a better return to creditors and save the business. But it means basically the directors have got to get their heads out of you know where a little bit earlier, and not leave it so late, and at least give 4 to 6 or preferably 8 weeks of working capital for the administrator, not just 7 days and a take it or leave it situation.
There's so many in the UK which we hear about, Stuart, which say our jobs and businesses have been saved, but you'd never hear about what the return to creditors is going to be. Do you think it actually improves the return to creditors?
No, I don't, and we've got evidence to back that up. I know, as I said, we only saw 10% of deals over the 5 years, 2015 to 2020, but I did some research, or I had research done by Wolverhampton University, or Aston Business School, I think it was, and over a 2-year period, 2018 through to 2019, they found that returns to creditors were no better than under any other form of insolvency process. And the main beneficiaries were the secured creditors. At the end of the day, they either roll over their security as part of the deal, or they're not even regarded as a connected party until that is now. That's another major change in the current legislation. Secured creditors can be regarded as connected and have to have an independent evaluation if they, for example, own a controlling interest in the company. So they got off lightly in the past, but no, returns to creditors were no better, if not slightly worse, to be honest.
All right. Not even with service in.
I just like to pick up on John's point. He's mentioned it a couple of times, valuations. Are you saying that these valuations are made public, Jock? Because here in the UK, that's a big bone of contention at the moment. IPs do not want to release their valuations.
Stuart, they're not made public, but if somebody wants to bring a proceeding against either the director or the IP, you better have a valuation, and it better be a good one.
All right, thanks.
I think any responsible insolvency practitioner would always make sure they had a proper independent valuation for the assets they were selling on. You know, I don't think I've ever, in my life, I've ever sold anything on without making sure I've got someone minding my back on the valuation, someone I trust and rely on to give me the best price. Now, I was just thinking, Stuart, and really Jock as well, and Rabbit, about businesses which have little or no tangible assets, like service industries and things like that. You hear about one, and certainly look in this country, 1 or 2 firms of solicitors who've gone through like a PrePack sort of sale and stuff like that. You know, is it a better way of dealing with, say, a service industry which, when it comes down to it, has little or no physical assets, but they've a lot of assets really, which is in the intellectual property and the staff and the people who work with them.
Yeah, I think that was how the PrePacks were originally meant to operate, in that, as you say, staff walking out the door, taking the intellectual property with them was the fear. And if they could do something quickly to prevent that, it would save the business as a going concern. It would preserve those jobs. The problem is that it then mushroomed into any type of organisation because it was seen as a quick way of rescuing the business.
Yeah.
So, yeah, saving jobs is always the first line of the justification for a PrePack, I find.
So, yeah, Stuart knows I've said this to him before. If I was a rogue, how would I try and circumvent the legislation? And I think, Stuart, you've told me basically, if I was a rogue director, I would find a rogue IP, if such things exist. And I'd find an IP who was willing to put his neck on the block against an adverse report and proceed on a sale. Would you agree, Stuart?
And form a similar sounding company, get it through the company's house and sell to that company. Who's going to spot it apart from the RPB? And in all fairness to RPBs, they do their best, but they're only sampling reports. They're not looking at every one. They haven't got the time to look at every one. And I'm sure the IP community would say, but there are no rogues. That's going to be one.
It's true. Rocket, do you have any serial sort of entrepreneurs to be polite about it?
I wanted to come to that point which Jock had said serial offenders.
Yeah.
For being a serial offender, one thing is very necessary, and a main ingredient is that he needs to get back on track. Right. So since 2016, when the Act has come in, still most of the cases who have gone into liquidation cannot become serial offenders so fast. So it takes almost 240 days, which have been given in the code, but it takes almost more than that, almost 2 years, 2.5 years for the process to complete. So till now, I think the first offenses are going on. The second offense might come another 3-4 years later.
Yeah, so watch this space then, Rocky. Yeah, watch this space. We'll see what Jock, sorry, Stu.
I was saying the theory we were told, which brought the Enterprise Act to fruition, was that it's all part of failure is the learning curve, and we got that from the Americans. You've got to fail in business at least 3 times before you know what you're doing, apparently.
The case in point is Disney, I believe.
Yeah, Jockey. I always think that in Australia they've a very harsh attitude towards failure and business failure.
Oh, we've allowed some very rich people to get away with it a couple of times in the past, and there's been some high-profile examples. I won't mention them, but the personal liability of directors, I think, is possibly second only to the Germans in the extent and how we go. It has been for many, many decades basically regarded as a creditor-friendly jurisdiction. That is now changing with things such as the adoption of the UNCITRAL model law. We've now adopted that, as have many other countries. So there's starting to be more of a reconstruction mindset, shall we say, along with turnaround organisations and things like that. So Australia's to an extent falling in line with the UK. We're not as pro-debtor as the United States by any means. So somewhere in the middle, but not as pro-creditor as we were in the past. But I just wanted to pick up on something that Stuart said a moment ago. The test under our legislation is when you're selling, say, the example that you used of selling a services company to a new entity or a related party, the test is simply the market value of the property, or, because there's not much you can say for a market in a service company, the best price that was reasonably obtainable for the property, having regard to the circumstances that existed at the time. So that's your wriggle room. If you were taking your example of the person who was seeking to circumvent the legislation, he needs someone to give some evidence that the price that he got was the best price reasonably obtainable at the time. And if it wasn't very much, bad luck, that was the market.
And most of the reports that you read, the insolvency practitioner's report, will make that statement and even go so far as to say, how many bids they had and it's usually the incumbent that knows the value best. And I don't disagree with that. All that's happening in the legislation now is that someone independently looks at that and sees whether it's reasonable or not. And we use this word reasonable a lot in legal circles, but the evaluator's opinion has to be whether the grounds for the sale and the consideration given were reasonable. That wonderful word, reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah. Before we wrap this presentation up, the discussion up, I want to touch upon the COVID crisis, which we've all been affected by. You know, from my point of view, India is going through a dreadful situation at present, and our hearts go out to them. Australia seems to have relatively got off lightly, compared by basically isolating itself. And we have family and friends who struggled to get back to Australia where they live, and then spent some time in a hotel when they actually got back. And sure, you know, we know what it's like in this country. We've been locked up, let out, locked up, let out. Sometimes we don't know what we're doing. We have to wear masks, etc., etc. Does the panel think that the COVID crisis will cause an increase in PrePacks as business come out of the difficult situation and maybe have to jettison some of their old debt and start afresh to get some lift off? Stu?
I think definitely once the government support is pulled back, but that's going to be difficult to do. That's going to be a very hot political potato when they start taking away government support, forbearance on VAT, forbearance on rent. We've already seen CVAs that you mentioned being challenged by landlords who say that they're unfair and too supportive. Once all that washes through, then there will be quite an increase in companies failing, definitely. Whether they'll go through the PrePack route or a CVA is yet to be seen.
Jock, what's the situation in Australia?
I wish I had my crystal ball, Peter, to be able to pick you up on that. My experience tends to make me support much of what Stuart has said. Our position is, firstly, all government support has now terminated as at 31 March. So there was basically 12 months of JobKeeper type schemes, but that's now completely finished. Surprisingly, the property market did not crash. Everyone was predicting major property price reductions. And in Australia, property markets have always been a very strong indicator of financial health of the economy. We found out, somewhat to our surprise, that property prices are actually going up because very many expats, as we call them, people working overseas, have returned to Australia thinking it's safer because of its COVID record and looking to buy places. So in fact, the property market's hotted up, not gone that way. Nobody predicted that. And the huge budget that was only delivered last week by the Treasurer, I've lost track of how many billions or trillions of dollars that has been injected into the economy for the avowed purpose of reducing unemployment, currently only a bit over 6%, down to 4.5%. If they've got that right, then the companies that fail will have very few assets, and it'll be an orthodox market for insolvency and reconstruction. I'm not saying that the Liberal government has got it entirely right, but there's a chance that they have. So the short answer to that very long question was, will PrePacks occur? Probably not, because of the legislation and because there's probably not going to be the market for them beyond normal insolvency conditions.
Right. Okay, thanks, Joe. Rocky, how do you see it coming out in India over the next maybe few months, a year or so?
We are awaiting a deluge of insolvencies and bankruptcies, and as far as PrePacks are concerned, they're very quite new tools for the MSME sector, and I have actually no idea. Rather, I am pessimistic that they would be used that much.
Yeah, I think counterintuitively, you know, the actual insolvency numbers in the UK have been dropping, and Stuart will correct me if I'm wrong. It's all seems to have got quiet, and property prices have gone off like a rocket. There's so much money sloshing around that, you know, nobody's really bothered, and we've still got the debt forgiveness for rent, taxes and what have you. And there's a lot of government money in terms of loans and guarantees for loans. So there's lots of support all around. And as Stuart alludes to, it's the winding out of all this, which is going to be the difficult situation. You know, it's going to be long and slow, and probably necessarily so, before we get to the end of it all. And somewhere down the line, maybe there is going to be an increase in corporate insolvency, and they talk the same about personal insolvency, but that's not what we're talking about today. Is there any...
Peter, but could I just remind you of a couple of old adages?
Go on.
Rule number one, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Yeah.
That is cruel. That happens in insolvency all the time.
That's
and
true.
The other one, when you're talking about the money sloshing around, it was Leonard Cohen who said, the rich have got their snouts in the troughs of the poor.
I should have remembered that as a Leonard Cohen fan. Yeah. Stuart, final words.
Well, I think, as you say, will wash out eventually. I'm not sure there's that much money sloshing around, other than people haven't been commuting, haven't been paying their office rates, and haven't been paying, you know, their ground rent. So yes, there's money available to spend at the moment. We're in the fortunate position of, hopefully in a few weeks' time, being freed of all restraints. So people will be out there fueling money back into the economy. So there's going to be a balance between money coming into the economy and these companies that are just living on borrowed time. And as you say, Peter, it will be a while before that washes through. I'm thinking in terms of Q4. Traditionally in the UK, as you know, Peter, companies fall over the Christmas New Year period, and I think that's when things will start to heat up.
Rocky, do you want to say a few final words?
We really hope that in the Indian market and the Indian context, we have less of insolvencies and bankruptcies, and PrePacks are used, and most importantly, for the individuals and the partnership firms and the sole proprietorships, the government should notify the insolvency and bankruptcy and bring in PrePacks for them, so that at the time when the court starts functioning, they have an option to get out of that situation easily.
Okay, gentlemen, Rocky, Stu, Joe, thank you for your time today. Literally, I can actually go to the pub and go in the pub now. Because from today in the UK, we can actually go inside pubs and restaurants, which I think we're all looking forward to doing. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
It's great. And thanks for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.